Bonjour tout le monde. On va faire la présentation en anglais parce qu'on travaille principalement en anglais. Je voulais juste prendre un moment pour remercier les organisateurs et vous d'être là. Voilà. Ouais, perfect. So I will present you the World Benchmarking Alliance today, and more specifically our human rights data and our corporate human rights benchmark. So the World Benchmarking Alliance is a global non-for-profit organization that develops open source benchmarks and methodologies that benchmark companies on their contributions towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. To do that, we developed seven systems transformations, and identified 2,000 companies, some of the world's most influential companies, that we assess across a set of benchmarks that belong to these transformations. So we look at climate and decarbonization, digital inclusion, urban, as well as social, that I will focus on today. Following the SDGs principle, leave no one behind, our social data is at the heart of the model. No, if we can stay, thank you very much. So our social transformation has two catalytic topics that you can see on the two sides, human rights and gender. I will focus on the human rights data today. My colleague Sophia will follow by presenting our gender data. In human rights, we look at companies at scale and in depth. At scale, we assess 2,000 companies on the initial steps they take towards achieving and respecting human rights. We look at policy commitments, at the initial steps they take on human rights due diligence, grievance mechanisms, among other things. In depth, we have our corporate human rights benchmark that includes over 50 indicators that measure companies' performance on human rights. I will call the corporate human rights benchmark from now on the CHRB. If we can move to the next slide, please. So a little bit of background on the CHRB. In 2011, the first global set of operational principles, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, were officially endorsed. However, there was no way to measure if companies were following these principles. So the CHRB, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, started as a multi-stakeholder initiative that included investors, data providers, and NGOs, with the aim to translate these principles into measurable indicators in order to measure corporate performance and drive a race to the top among companies. So the CHRB includes 5 measurement areas. We're looking at policy commitments, at how companies embed human rights into their processes, including human rights due diligence. We also look at sector-specific performance indicators. We look at remedies and grievance mechanisms and how companies responded to controversies. We measure companies across 5 sectors, 230 companies across 5 sectors: ICT manufacturing, automotive manufacturing, apparel, extractives, and food and agricultural products. We identified these sectors as high-risk sectors for negative human rights impact, specifically for the impact on workers and local communities through extensive stakeholder consultations. Our benchmarks looks at own operation indicators and supply chain indicators. As I mentioned, we have over 50 indicators. And we cover topics such as working hours, freedom of association, as well as purchasing practices, among other things. We cover 6 regions and 29 countries, with most of the companies that we benchmark headquartered in North America, Europe, and East Asia. However, the supply chain implications are globally applicable. What else can I tell you about the CHRB? Maybe I will move to describe a few ways on how we use the data of the benchmark, how stakeholders are using the data of the benchmark. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the last iteration of our benchmark was in 2023. When we publish a benchmark, we publish all of the underlying data as well as individual company scorecards. My colleague Sophia will provide more information on how we publish the data and the relevant links, so I won't go into that. What I want to focus on in the few minutes I have left is how investors are using our data and hopefully inspire you to do the same. So our last benchmark came out last year. The next iteration will come out in 2026. We have a biannual research cycle. And what we see over the years, after 5 iterations of the benchmarks, is that while companies improve, the pace of improvement is quite slow. Even our highest scoring company on the benchmark are somewhere in the 50% range. So nowhere near achieving the full score on human rights, which is not surprising. It's a very difficult topic to cover, assess, and also implement internally. What we see is that our work with investors creates real impact. And we really see investors as a key stakeholder to push companies towards better performance on human rights. So a few examples. We work with the PRI Advanced. They're using our extractive sector company scorecards to inform their engagement, to help their members engage with companies in the sector. Another example of voting, Aviva investors are using our data to inform their voting policies, and they even vote against relevant board members that are up for elections if the companies did not improve their human rights score. Another example is that we work with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. It's a coalition of over 200 investors, mostly US based, but not only. And they issued a public statement targeting the companies that scored 0 on human rights due diligence. What they also do is that they hold one-on-one engagement calls with the companies that scored 0, trying to push them to improve their score on the benchmark. More generally, I think our individual company scorecards are being used by various investors. If you're going on an engagement call with a company, you can look at where are the gaps, what they need to improve on, and what are areas of opportunity for the company. So we see it as a very useful tool for investors. In a few days as well, I believe next week, we're also publishing 2 investor guidance documents, one that will focus on human rights and one on gender, where we translated our key findings into questions that you can ask companies when you engage with them.